Welcome to Coaching Uncaged by Animas, the podcast that explores the art, science, and career of coaching.
Well, Yannick, we do this each time, or at least we've done it a couple of times, where at the end of a season we flip the script and we actually put the spotlight on you.
Yeah.
Traditionally, we have focused on what you've taken from the journey through multiple conversations, but I think in this conversation, and I'll explain why in a second, but I'd like to put the spotlight firmly on you. Who are you as a human being, as a coach, as a supervisor, as a practitioner of multiple modalities? Where have you come from? Where are you now? Where are you going? A whole range of kind of questions about who you are. And before I do my loose phenomenological introduction of you, because I don't have any notes, I think it's worth saying that
I
the reason
I don't either usually.
oh, don't you? Well, that's even more impressive then. But the reason why we're kind of really putting the spotlight on you is because this is the end of an era in some ways, because this will be the last podcast you do for Animas, at least that we've got planned. And you've been doing it for, I think, 3 seasons since 2021. I think you did 21 to 22, 22, 23, 23, 24. So like 3 seasons across those 4 years. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Might be
Yeah.
4. But yeah, it's been a
Maybe
while. It
4
feels
seasons.
forever.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for being such a consistent and brilliant host, because I mean I was watching some of your conversations again recently, and I really appreciate the way you bring very fresh in the moment thinking to the conversation, as opposed to, what a lot of people can do, which is to script something or over prepare it or have a bunch of questions which you get asked regardless of what's come back to you. So it feels very dialogic, and I've appreciated that aspect of your work. And I suppose in the spirit of that, I decided not to, well, because I'm lazy, I guess, but I decided not to prepare too much for this myself, and not even to kind of dive into your specifics of your background, but rather to reflect on how I've come across you and felt you and experienced you since we've met. And then I'd love to get you to introduce yourself more with some detail, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
So,
Sounds
so,
great. I love
so
the phenomenological spirit, and I always appreciated that being sitting at the heart of Animus, right? That's why I
yeah.
always felt so connected to the school without actually ever being an official part of it, right? Because the things I value, they live in the way that you live your life, and also that you have set up the school and that the school operates. So it's been a real pleasure. And yeah, let's go. Let's do this.
Yeah, great. I mean, one of the things I remember learning very early in coaching, or maybe I don't know if I learned it or just sort of picked it up, just organically, but was the sense of what remains is what matters. So sometimes, you see coaches taking copious notes about what everything their client says, and it's almost like if I capture everything on paper, nothing can escape my notice. Whereas I've always felt like what sticks matters in some way. And that's not to say that if you forget something or they forget something, it doesn't matter, but somehow what sticks matters. And that's why I thought, when I think about you, I was thinking, what sticks for me? And the first thing is, of course, our encounter in, I'm not sure what year it was probably 2015 or 16, when, of
15,
course,
yeah.
the very first time we met was when you live chatted our website, which was, by the way, the very first time we ever put that live chat on our site. And I got this hello message coming through, and I'm
It was my
100%.
very first Facebook chat ever as well.
Yeah, it's incredible. And of course, we connected, and from there, we built a relationship around the idea of existential coaching. And I remember you turning up to the office in Holloway Road, which is where Animas was based at that time, with your big skateboard. I remember you had this big skateboard, and you just seemed like such a breath of fresh air to my particular world, because in a sense, if you looked at my team, then we were all kind of similar-ish people, same sort of age, same kind of background, and there was something quite homogenous about us, whereas you brought this kind of vibrant youthfulness. I mean, you were a lot younger then,
I had
Yannick.
much longer hair. Yeah, I still ride the same skateboard, but now I ride my daughter to school with it.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. But I remember, I think it seemed to remember you turned up in a cream suit from memory
Did
on a
I?
skateboard. And I remember thinking, wow, what a guy this is. He's so fascinating, because not only were you deeply immersed in the field of coaching and existential philosophy, but you seem to live that life. You see sometimes existential thinkers who seem to live life in a very humdrum way, and you think, well, what are you really taking from these ideas? this idea of commitment to the act of living, and I felt that from you, so that's why I resonated very much with you. And of course, from there we passed the baton of existential coaching from me to you, and you ran that course, that CPD course, for us for a number of years, and I really appreciated that because you brought a level of rigor to that which I didn't. Like in my classic Nick Bolton style, a lot of what I do tends to be coming from a place of what emerges from me rather than a more technical thing. And I really loved the fact that you started to bring a level of rigor and specificity to that course, which I'm not sure how long you ran it for, but it must have been a good 3 years or so.
At least.
And then from there, you jumped onto the very first ever supervision course I ran, coaching supervision course.
Mhm.
And from there, of course, you became a faculty member of the International Centre for Coaching Supervision, and you've been a consistent part of that from the day it was born in 2020. And of course, the other thing I notice about you is that you're way, way, way ahead of your field, in as much as you've clearly built an AI avatar or multiple versions of yourself, because there's no way you could be in so many places at the same time
I did
doing
think
what you're
about that
doing.
quite a lot, but it's not happened yet.
Okay, well, I'm not convinced, but okay, if you tell me that's true, I'm gonna have to believe you. But the very fact that you've been, I just remember thinking, how does Yannick find so much space to do so much thinking and reflecting and practice around these fields
Mm.
in so many different contexts? And I know that you ended up working for Cambridge University, so as well as ICCS and your own work, of course, which I'm sure you'll share in a second. You ended up working with Cambridge University and no doubt others, I'm sure, which I'm not even aware of. And so going back to my starting point, which is my experience of you, is that somebody's utterly committed to this profession of coaching and
Mm.
coaching supervision, and no doubt wider than that, I suspect, more like transformative change in different forms, with coaching being the shape it takes, let's say.
Mhm.
And but not only the practice of it, but the thinking of it and the ideas of it and the desire to influence the profession. So that's how I've experienced you over the last 8 years or so. And I wonder if there's anything you want to add to that in terms of more detail. Like, oh, and of course, by the way, I should add that, of course, you created your Rocket Supervision program, which is a fantastic way of combining multiple aspects of supervision and the business of coaching and coaching itself. So wonderful stuff. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, just to give a bit of background?
Ooh, yeah, first of all, I vividly remember going on Twitter at the time and just typing in existential coaching, because yes, I'm very interested in what other perspectives are out there. And a theme throughout my life has been integration and balance. I found that in sports. I found that in the kind of people I hang out with, what I've studied academically. I've always been kind of bringing things together. And so naturally, I found myself kind of walking the turfs between different coaching schools and different approaches and different theoretical and philosophical frameworks. And then at some point, I was diving deeper into existentialism and existential coaching, because that's where I had found my home. Right? I came from positive psychology, but then felt I really needed something that goes deeper, something that goes beyond what is right with people. And I'm sure people have heard me say these kind of things before, but I found a home in existential philosophy. And so existential coaching has become a real passion, because it is such fertile ground for integrating other approaches, other methodologies, other tools, other processes, other lines of inquiry, other powerful questions. You have this framework which makes sense to me in terms of how the world works and how we relate to the world and other people, and ourselves. And then I can bring stuff into that. So, and that's where I was just looking up existential coaching to see who else is around, because it's still very much a developing field. I wish I had a lot more time and resources to just grow that, but it's still developing. So, but yeah, I'm kind of proud that I was able to contribute so much. And this sense of contribution is really something that shifted around this time that we've met, right? Because I was like just in my early 30s at the time. So it's almost 10 years ago. And around that time, something shifted in me from doing things because I like doing them and they seem to benefit me and they're creative, interesting things to do, to really looking outside. What can I contribute? And that's been a significant shift. It's also to do with, I got married around the time. I met my now wife just after I think we've started hanging out professionally and also personally. So you've been there throughout the entirety of that relationship, and that's also shifted something in me. That commitment to a life, to a path, and I'm very focused on what's happening right in front of me. Right, presence is my superpower, as often coaches say. Right, this is something I can really lean into. I don't naturally focus on what's happening in 10 years' time, right? So this planning doesn't come naturally to me. But when you meet someone who you want to be with, who's quite future focused, you're invited to actually start thinking about, well, okay, well, I'm 30 now. I just met the love of my life. Kids become something that seems to be natural in my vicinity now. Oh, yeah, well, now we're thinking about the future. That is an interesting shift. And once you start thinking about the future, I think you naturally start thinking about contribution. And that's been a really interesting shift, which you've been there for this whole time. And I think that's also what kind of drives me to contribute towards coaching as a field and supervision as a field. Because I do think the existential lens and the positive, particularly the positive existential lens with the positive psychology perspective and angle and principles in there, they really have something to offer, not just to coaches, not just to supervisors, but to the world. And I find a lot of energy and a lot of meaning in putting those thoughts out there. And I like thinking and I like challenging. And, I've needed to find a way to organize myself. And, I like creating these kind of conversations. I love doing the podcast, love doing my own podcast. I love having conversations. I mean, that's why I'm a coach. And so much energy flows from entering that sort of dialogue. And you can do dialogue in so many different ways. So we learn through conversations is what I often say. And you can do that in groups. You can do that one-to-one in teaching rooms. You can do that with friends. You can do that on social media. You can do that writing books and blogs and creating content. So it's been a really meaningful journey to lean into this sense of contribution and do it in a way that I enjoy my daily experience by creating more space for conversations and to allow other people to be part of those conversations. How amazing is it that with this kind of technology we have, you can sit in on a conversation between this Nick and this Yannick guy, or, like so many people in the world. And so much of the magic that sometimes coaching feels like, it's just very private. So it's been really meaningful to kind of get that out there, and also just to demystify what's happening in coaching rooms through, running more than 50 coaching labs now. It's so cool to get to see what's actually happening in those rooms and why it works, and to help coaches be better coaches has such a generative impact on the world. You work with one coach, they work with hundreds of people, if they keep it going, So contributing to coaches' developments and just thinking about the immense impact that this has on other people. I mean, now I go to conferences and people come to me like, oh yeah, I've been a student of yours 8 years ago. And there's something that you said in this lecture that really changed the way that I coach. And I now do this and those and all these amazing things. I'm like, wow, I had no idea what I said, but it's these little nuggets that people take from what feels just like a natural conversation. And you don't always hear about that. But that's been a really, really energizing force, and probably why I'm putting so much stuff out there. And how do I get that done? Over the time, I've delegated a lot more. Right now, I've invested working with a team. I have a process of creating content and putting things out there, but the source are still dialogue, conversations, and this drive to contribute and do something that's meaningful and enjoyable and fun.
There's so many little threads there, and I want to pick up on one, just and close it in my own mind, if that's okay. Which was just to tell you a little story. Which was I was talking to an alumna of ICCS a few days ago, and she said to me, Yannick, I used to love Yannick's sessions. She said, and there was something he once said. And I actually forgot what it was. That's not the point. It's not the content of what you said. But she said to me, and whenever I work with clients, I always tell them this. And I bet you wouldn't even remember saying it, Yannick. And I can't even remember what it was. But it's beautiful that something you said, probably as a relatively small throwaway comment, resonated with her to the extent that it's become almost part of her patter, let's say, for how she works with clients. And it reminds me of the idea of, Irvin Yalom's every contact leaves a trace, and you don't know what that trace is. You just know that every contact leaves a trace. So I just wanted to kind of share that little story, because it was literally 2 days ago that she told me that. She's like, I really love Yannick's sessions. And now the other thing I was going to
Oh, hold on, just it reminds me
go
of
for it, please.
this reminds me of donkey balls. Because I did one of the early existential coaching trainings I delivered for Animas. Somebody mentioned that everything we say or think travels through the universe for eternity. And I'm like, ooh, that's like 3 levels up from every contact leaves a trace. But then I just wrote donkey balls on a piece of paper and had a little chuckle.
Okay.
Because yes, we really leave something. And I had a legacy conversation with a coaching client of mine a couple of weeks ago. And they were thinking about what do they leave behind and the legacy they want to leave. And the realization they came to through that conversation was there is already a legacy. And whether people remember your name or not, most people don't remember the name of their great-grandparents. Like, who remembers their first and last name of your grandmother's parents? That's few. But they live in you because of all the things that have been passed down. And so that's incredible to see yourself nested within these systems and connected to different generations. And in a culture where family is not married into a Mexican family, right? The family structures are so much tighter. But here, the networks are different, right? And yes, every contact does leave a trace in some way. And even if people don't remember my name, if they remember something I said about coaching, or they just internalize it, even they think if it's theirs, if they have internalized it so much that they think it's theirs and they've said it, I can't trace back to where how you ask how you coach, who you ask how you coach, but I've asked the person that told me this, and they told me a name that I forgot, and they probably got it from somewhere else. So it's really nice to know that things are being passed down and that I can be contributing to that in some small way.
Yeah, that's great. And there's I mentioned there's a few threads I wanted to pick up on. Some are short and some are more the meat or the tofu of this conversation. But just to wrap up another one, I think for people, anyone listening to this, they might say, Coaching Labs, what's that? So if they've just come across you and I didn't give a sort of a detailed explanation of what you actually do now, just give us a bit of a context for what is it you do? What are the services you offer? Like what do you mean by Coaching Lab, and who is Yannick as a coach today?
Yeah, I've been very tempted to mention it all over the place on the podcast, but I kind of, that's my thing. But like basically, beginning of the pandemic, when ICCS was also born, I had already planned with a colleague of mine to start coaching labs. The vision of that was to have a coach a real client in like an old London theater, and then when it's done, put the audience lights on and have a conversation about what the hell just happened. Because there's not been enough. Now there's some, but it's really difficult still to find quality coaching demos online. There's now a good number, but it's still very rare that you get to have a conversation afterwards, critical conversation, critical dialogue about what was going on behind, in the back of the head of the coach. How did the client experience this question? Where did the question come from? What other questions did you consider? This connection from theory to practice is often kind of missing. And even in the best kind of coaching trainings, like Animas, for example, you get to see kind of short snippets. And often, like after the 115th student said that the best part of the training that they've just experienced was doing the thing in practice, getting some feedback on the thing, or seeing the master do it. Seeing an experienced coach demo the model that you've just said or the approach. I mean, that's what most students seem to value. And I'm a theory guy, and I know you love theory too, but like that link seemed to have been missing. So the coaching lab really was established as, let's watch a full-length coaching session, not just 10, 15-minute demo. That kind of seems staged, or it's always between coaches. Or in the feedback, they just kind of, massage each other's egos of how amazing this coach was. No, but actual critical engagement, 45 minutes demo, then a 45-minute conversation, and then take it out into breakout rooms and experiment. I want to create a community of practice where people are really committed to trying out new things and integrating. Just a place that is safe to just explore, try out some new stuff. I played around with some IFS questions and techniques and realized, oh my God, you can get to a level of depth very quickly. It's kind of scary almost, with people who are up to it. But like to see all of these ranges of different coaching approaches, there's so many different ones. And I just wanted to bring people together to be able to see that and make those connections. And maybe soon niche labs, because I've always invited very, very different coaches to come every month. We have 56 recordings now in the vault. I'm thinking now about, okay, let's do a series of 12 just positive psychology coaching or just supervision, just humanistic coaching or just executive coaching. I'm talking about an AI coaching lab with Rebecca, who we had on the podcast. So invite the different AI coaching modalities and see how they work. We just had one yesterday about the first AI supervision demo. And what a powerful tool for a coach after a session to just have a 10, 20-minute conversation with an AI, helping them to reflect on this session. And then decide what to bring to a human supervisor, for example. That just the potential of different approaches and the depth that people go to, and where's the line between coaching and therapy and mentoring and consulting and just being there and holding space. That's been a fascinating journey around the lab.
This is a sort of an aside for me, but as a curiosity, really. How have you found, let's call it the law of quantum mechanics, where the observer can't but help affect the observed. So how's that been experienced by the coaches and the clients?
Yeah, I found that fascinating because the vast majority of times they just completely forget about it super quickly. Because on Zoom, I was sad that we couldn't get into London theaters, right? Because 2020, we wanted to start January, then we moved it to March. And then in March, everything was shut down and we're still online. But very quickly, I realized it's a huge benefit, huge value in being able to just let the audience completely disappear. And then it feels like a normal Zoom session. So coach and client, if they're engaged in the conversation, very quickly forget about it. Some don't, and they reference the audience. And some of the more skilled coaches, they pick up on that because now the audience is an active part of what's happening in the coaching room. And if the client doesn't forget that the audience is there, that tells you something about the client. So you're using the here and now to kind of incorporate whatever is happening. And I was surprised at how many clients are turning up so open to being observed and allowing other coaches within the membership, right? This is not public on YouTube, but within the Coaching Lab community to learn from the coaching. So some good contracting is necessary. And the way that we record, I struggled to find a way to record this in an ethical way because I was concerned that people would show up guarded, right? But with good contracting around it and giving both coach and client a week after the recording, after the event, to ask for any edits or indeed to delete the whole thing, which happened a couple of times. Sometimes we open doors that we didn't anticipate. So, but yeah, I was surprised at how much the audience is being forgotten straight away and how open people are being observed. And I think it helps to be on Zoom, and it helps to be in this day and age where everything is being recorded all the time. So especially younger generations are a lot more desensitized to having like a recording button on.
Did you find that the AI coach was nervous?
No. But it's amazing. Yesterday, it suggested a brainstorm. And a brainstorm with an AI is entirely different ballgame. And all the suggestions were really good. But it was just like the AI brainstorming and the client sitting there like, whoa, this is all good. But like, this is like, whoa, that was an intense experience.
This is one of those moments where you say something and I want to go there because I think it's, even though it's not quite in tune with the session overall, but I'm kind of curious, I suppose, on your view of artificial intelligence in coaching, particularly as a coach from an existential perspective where relationship is so important, and if you like, the quality of compassion to suffer with is so important, and AI clearly doesn't suffer with the act of being human. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I've thought about it quite a lot lately, not at a level of depth that I would love to have time for. I did book in Rebecca's training, and learning more, committed to learning more about AI capabilities, because it's going to be a part of all of our lives, right? Whether we lean into it in our coaching or we embrace it as some sort of partner to the coaching, or if we keep our coaching completely human to human, but we will be affected by AI in some way. So I think everybody probably does a good job learning about how that works and what that's like. But in terms of possibilities, I tried. I was had a dark time to about AI, about everything that it could destroy or change or compromise, and I'm still worried about it. But I do try to focus on the potential here, and the potential is enormous, right? If I don't think it's helpful to think about it as AI coaches replacing human coaches. I think the coaches, somebody said, I think it was Lawrence Barrett, who was also here on the podcast. I think he commented on one of my posts saying that those coaches who act like robots should be replaced by robots. Right. So the kind of coaches that follow a methodology or clear process or a line of inquiry or a set line of grow questions or something like that. An AI will do that better. If it's not doing that already, it will do in relatively short period of time. Right. Clutterbuck, David Clutterbuck said that ACC coaches, he referred to them as the walking dead, that they're already obsolete. They just don't know it yet. So try to catch. Yeah, I thought so too. And he also said some other things that make me think he doesn't quite fully understand what AI is about and what it can contribute. But he did think about it quite some time, and he did clearly talk to some people. He's kind of stuck on this idea that we have like a second screen or something rolling in our inner eye that kind of suggests us questions we could throw in or tells us something about the body language and what it might mean. Give us data on like physiology of our client is like burp, burp, might be lying, or here's attention, or, heart rate just went up, which I could kind of see could be interesting. But then it clearly also takes us away from full presence. But what is full presence? Full presence also means we think about ourselves and we think about our past, or we're aware of the coaching goal, or we might be aware of other input we might be getting that could help us as coaches get more information, right? Some coaches are super aware of body language, and some coaches are not aware of body language at all. So some coaches are incapable of being aware of certain signs because of some neurodivergence, right? So it could really help coaches be more complete coaches to have some input from an AI. I could imagine that, and I see the potential in that. That's super interesting to think about. For now, I think the main value is that people who wouldn't have access to a coach, no way, just because they couldn't afford it, they would have access to a coaching methodology that can help them think better about something, right? I kind of feel, the other day, other week, I think, I really felt for the coaches that became coaches because they loved the human-to-human interaction, and now they're experienced coaches and they got a really good job just going over protocols of chatbots, making sure that the company is not going to get sued,
Right.
Because especially in the corporate space, the AI systems will be doing a whole lot of the coaching going forward. Because a lot of the coaching in corporate spaces, especially if it's below senior kind of level,
Sure.
it's quite limited in its capability, and it often follows clear processes, and it's very action, performance, and behavior focused. And that sort of thing is well done by an AI. But it will need some human oversight. So what I think is going to happen is even someone like me might refer my client to an AI system to do a strength assessment and then come back, and then we do the feedback, or maybe there's a feedback methodology that they could really profit from, or maybe they have an accountability partner. I'm not going to check in with you 2-3 times a week, but my extension, my AI assistant, I could offer you that my AI assistant checks in with you a couple of times a week on something that you decided you commit to, and somebody might really appreciate that. So existentially difficult, right? Because it's really about being with each other, and it's about that human-to-human relationship. But if the AI is an extension of the human relationship, then I can see it add value rather than take value away if it's well managed.
Interesting. I want to briefly strip the names out of this and talk more abstractly because David Clutterbuck's not here to say what he meant by that comment about The Walking Dead, and also that show wasn't very good after about season 5. So, but,
it's a different topic. It's expanding now. There's a bunch of spin-offs. Some of them worth seeing.
ACC Walking Dead. But that let's strip that out as a person. But that comment, if we assume that was a spoken comment, it seems strange because an ACC is simply a stage of development that's on its way somewhere. It's not actually a static stopping point. So that seems to imply you're walking dead because you're not moving on. But an ACC is a natural first step towards PCC and MCC, or whichever framework you're in, whether it's the MCC or whatever.
Keeps coaches on their toes. You need to keep developing, right? You need to add the extra edge. You need to be better as a coach.
But yes, absolutely. But what's coming to mind for me as I hear that is the risk that those already at the seeming pinnacle of the profession use the advent of AI to crush the next generation of young coaches because, well, you won't be good enough to you're the Walking Dead until you get to where I am, and that seems like a strange way of trying to,
and it's so out of character for David because he's so committed. I think somebody Pasmo said something similar. So there's people in that field that are so committed to the next generation of coaches and to help them. So it would seem out of character with that. But I think there's something to the argument that I thought about it first in the context of lawyers, right? Somebody mentioned that junior lawyers will have a really hard time learning on the job because they won't get any of those jobs anymore because the AI is doing a junior lawyer's job in a split second that a junior lawyer would take several days. So how are they going to get good at their profession if they don't get the actual work anymore?
That implies that, well, this is an interesting conversation. I hope it's okay to stick with this for a little bit. But it seems to imply that the only role for a junior coach is to do process-based coaching. And I don't believe that's the case. I mean, most coaches are very experienced human beings. They're not 19-year-olds with very little life experience. So they come into being a new coach. And yes, the skills might be fresh, but their experience of being a human being isn't fresh. And actually, that's what they're bringing, regardless of whether they've just qualified or they're ACC or PCC or whichever criteria you use. And actually, what I wonder if this is going to cause is a defocus away from process competencies and a focus on human presence at every level of coaching. And that could be a very, very welcome move, actually, because one of the things we're struggling with at Animas is that we're a transformative coaching school, but we have these ICF competencies, which can often be extremely rigid in terms of the assessment of coaches, to the point where you think you're somewhat dehumanizing the coach. And I would actually like to see that dissolve somewhat. Maybe this is going to create that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I see the shift coming in coach training, particularly that the existential approaches, the Gestalt approaches, the humanistic approaches, person-centered, the stuff that's relational will play a much, much bigger role. And that the people who come into coaching, I have that a bunch of times, right? That students sometimes, because I've taught on so many different programs, and students sometimes feel a bit overwhelmed if you throw them into the relational end of coaching straight away. The ones that bring, like you said, this relational depth from their relationships or their work or their careers or their families already, they resonate with the existential approaches and the more relational approaches. But a lot of coaches, they are process oriented. And in the beginning, if you look at, maturity models in coaching, it helps to have something that you can hold on to that kind of guides you through a process or a conversation. And then you add the relational bit.
Or we think it does. Because I remember when I studied at Metanoia, I was one of only 2 coaches in a class of 12 people going through this master's in psychological coaching. So there were 10 complete non-coaches who were just embarking on a journey to become a coach through a master's program. And we weren't introduced to any models. We were never taught the GROW model or any of that stuff. We were taught, clearly I was used to that anyway, and so was the other coach, but the other 10 people, they were taught from scratch to just use themselves. They were taught the principles of non-advice and non-judgment, but they weren't taught a process once. And I was amazed over a 2-year process of how well that worked. Because, obviously, when you run a coaching school, you do tend to rely on certain models as a piece of driftwood to hang on to. And I was like, I mean, okay, that's a 2-year journey, which is somewhat different from a 9-month journey, but it really made me think, to
So
what
we
extent do we impose that idea of models on new coaches?
so we might need to, I mean, they make it much easier to teach it and to compact it into a weekend or 5
Measure it.
weekends, right? 6 months course, and you're then a coach because you're holding on to the
Yes.
models. That was a 2-year process, if that's well designed. I think you're right. We might not need all the models. But then it becomes very different, right? And then, okay, what's coaching, what's therapy? And that's something I've noticed, particularly from this last season of Coaching Uncaged, is that more and more of the thought leaders in coaching seem to say, well, the difference between coaching and therapy is not the modality or the process or the methodology or how I relate to people. It's just who those people are. Just in
100%.
coaching, generally more resourced,
Yes.
And so I think we'll find that coaching and therapy will become more and more close in terms of how they work. Just matters of who do you work with, and then
Oh, the
that
risk,
kind of
the
coaching
risk,
requires a lot more training.
yes, 100%. Yeah. At the risk of sounding judgmental, it surprises me it's taking so long to get to that point where people are recognizing it's not what the coach or the therapist does, it's who the coach or the therapist is working with that's the
Mm.
real determinant. Because that's something I said for years and years and years in the introduction to transformative coaching, is that that psychodynamic coaching looks far more like psychodynamic therapy than psychodynamic therapy looks like cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's not really about whether it's coaching or therapy. It's
Yeah.
who's the client and what's their need,
I
and
remember.
therefore what's the practitioner.
Yeah, I remember a moment with Jerry Colonna from, I don't know, a couple of seasons ago, where he had this lapsus where he wanted to say coaching, but he said therapy because for him they've just merged so much because of the way that he's worked and leaning into this relational process and exploring people's past. Because your past makes you who you are in this moment. So are you really exploring somebody's past, or are you exploring how they're showing up right now and what that's connected to?
Yeah. This is a fantastic conversation. I'm going to move it on a little bit, just because otherwise I could selfishly hang into this little space for too long. But let's think about where you've arrived as a coach. I mean, there's AI and it's doing its thing, and you're fascinated. I'm fascinated, but there's also you right now as a coach,
Yeah.
and you will have matured and developed. And perhaps once upon a time, I'm guessing you would have seen yourself as a existential coach and have certain clarity around what that means. But over time, those sorts of things start to fade a little bit and the clarity goes. And I'm curious, how do you see yourself as a coach or practitioner now? How would you begin to define yourself in some way?
Yeah, it's tricky to define yourself, right? Because I remember actually when you had offered some spaces for coaches to figure out their practice and business and marketing. I remember I asked you a question about niching, and you said, "But Yannick, you already have a niche. You're an existential coach." And it really shifted something for me because it allowed me to lean into that, because I hadn't recognized that as a niche. I thought I needed a demographic, right? And so that was a crucial point for me where I started owning this existential thing as a niche. But then I felt I needed to make it positive because the positive psychology had such a big influence on it. And then I had a time a couple of years later where I really wanted to drop all of the labels and just call it sitting down with Yannick for a conversation, right? I got really excited about your idea of transformative dialogue, right? Because that it is a dialogue. I mean, it doesn't sell well, right? That's the thing with labels. So when you start thinking about marketing and scaling, it's important that there's a label that people can connect with and that they understand what it is. And with existential coaching, you just don't. And with most types of coaching, you don't really, So who am I as a practitioner? Well, that depends who I'm working with, right? Because everybody I sit down with, sometimes I'm invited to do an existential coaching demo, and then, I kept telling now people like, yeah, I can do a coaching session and we have a conversation and I can reflect on it through an existential lens or a positive existential lens. But I can't guarantee you that it's going to be an existential coaching session because it might just not lend itself to that, right? Existential themes are always something that I'm attuned to. And I'm naturally curious about the kind of big picture relationships with endings and uncertainty and authenticity and isolation and freedom and absurdism. But that might not be the conversation that we need to have. I had a psychedelic integration session with someone who wanted to make sense. He was seeking an experience with a very powerful psychedelic, and then we had some sessions set up afterwards so he could make sense of what that now means. And I remember it was one of my kind of first engagement with that sort of work. And I was really excited about it. And then it turned out to just be a performance coaching engagement, because he didn't need to make more sense of it. It all already made sense. It's just about implementing these insights into how he's engaging with his life and work going forward. So in some ways it was very disappointing because it isn't really, it took the kind of excitement out of it. But that's not what he needed. So it felt right to just deliver that. So what kind of coach am I? Well, I always have an existential lens to my practice. I always have that positive psychology lens, like what's right with you? How can we build on strength and resources? I have a strength in being very present, and there's this tuning in and out, this tuning into somebody's phenomenological experience and letting new meanings emerge from that, and then tuning out and seeing patterns and connecting this to the bigger picture. So, and then whatever modalities or tools or even sometimes exercises or homework makes sense. So every coaching engagement is a little bit different depending on how somebody thinks or how they learn, what they want to achieve, and what kind of themes are there. And I think essentially it's just a process to offer more choice for people. And I think my main driver in that work is that people don't sit there having regrets about what they could have done back in the day, because they now have some awareness about what they could be doing. So then you can still have regrets 20 years from now and wish you would have chosen different, but you can own that you did have the choice. So who I am as a practitioner, well, that's kind of what drives it. Do I have a couple of fancy words that make it clear what that is? No, because most coaching engagements or supervision engagements, they're based on having developed a bit of a relationship and listening to somebody, having some sort of conversation so that the doors into development, professional or personal, open. And I realized that that kind of dialogue can start happening without me knowing that the other person exists. Right? That's why I'm putting out a lot of content, because I realized through writing and through recording little videos or sharing some thoughts, I don't need to follow the blueprint of what good content is. I just need to put thoughts and ideas out, and people resonate with that. And sometimes they have full-blown conversations with me, and I don't even know that they exist. And then they come to a consultation, and it was clear they already know me, and they already spent hours of time with me. I'm just getting to know them, right? So it's a relationship business, as Steve Chandler once said, right? And it's been really meaningful to know, again, that you sometimes don't know where the contact was and what the trace were.
Wow.
But getting the feedback that this does something is really, really cool. And then, having those conversations, once you meet someone and you experience someone, you can then adjust what you have and seeing whether it's a good fit and it's a good match. And I'm particularly excited about big existential questions, but in my experience, they're always underneath the surface. And even if it's a really mundane, seemingly behavioral goal or some performance goal, usually the big existential concerns are there connected to it. And sometimes it's important we have that conversation, and sometimes we can just be more straightforward with it.
Sure.
So it's really about going to explore what you need. And if it feels right to work with me, great. If it feels right to work with someone else, great. If I think you'd be better off with someone else, I'll tell you.
It's funny. I mean, I've just literally just finished rewriting Coaching in a Nutshell, which was a book I first wrote in 2010.
I know, I read it.
Yeah, it was a very, very basic book. But I wrote that before Animas even existed. It was when it was the Smart School. So it was very much a performance coaching approach. And so I've rewritten it completely from scratch. And one of the things I talk about is, the 3 levels of coaching: performance, developmental, and transformative. But that transformative isn't only focused on the internal, awareness and kind of exploration of those paradigms, it's also going to focus on getting stuff done. At what point does that awareness need to materialize in the world in form of behavior or results? And that's what you're alluding to, is that those existential issues are there, but they might not need to be talked about because now it's time to do something. So I really love that. But I wonder, that being the case, Yannick, you know, it seemed like what I said to you about existential coaching being a niche. Well, that's kind of dissolved a bit because you're no longer only that. So are you now just a brand? Without wanting to make you blush, are you now just a brand? Is Yannick Jacob a brand that attracts people because you're known?
That's been a weird experience, this transformation, I don't know, this evolution into a brand. And it's been a struggle, right, in some existential ways, because I said, well, I don't have an AI clone, right? But I do have a person who's writing some copy for me. For example, like the process that we have is every Tuesday I sit down with Ambika. At the moment, it used to be Martin, now it's Ambika, might be somewhere else in the future, I don't know. But like, I like conversations. So the way that I've set this up is I have a conversation with someone, and then out of that, we take certain snippets that become individual videos, or Ambika has learned to be very close to what I'm saying and not add any of her own stuff. So the videos, for example, that we currently share on LinkedIn, they're video snippets of me talking to her. Usually you can't see her, but it's a conversation, right, with coaches in mind, and she's very interested in coaching, so it works. But then she takes that and distills the essence of that in a little caption. So I don't write that stuff. Right? And some of the email campaigns that are going out, if we have a new coaching lab, an exciting one, or a new offer or something like that, just released this huge starter kit for coaches that's super interesting. But like these kind of email sequences, she writes, and then I look over it, I do some edits, but like it's not 100% my voice anymore. And that was really difficult and challenging, and still is to some extent, because authenticity is such a high value of mine, and this integrity and this being real. You know, I'm a child of hip hop, like being real was always very important. Do your thing, do it your way, and then from my upbringing, also do it yourself. And that doing it yourself was no longer viable. I just couldn't, and I also didn't want to. I wanted to reach more people, and you can't do it on your own. You need people in your boat. And so, but then it's what I'm saying, it's what I mean, but it's not exactly my words. And that's been difficult to have other people put stuff out with my name underneath. You know, and it's important that we connect with my name underneath. I considered maybe just having Ambika's name underneath, but then, you know, I think she's right that if somebody else sends out emails in their name under your brand, we're not big enough to do that yet. But yeah, that's been a really interesting move, because first you become a coach, and then you're a decent coach, and you realize there's another entire skill set you're missing, which is the entrepreneurial skills, the business building skills. And then I've kind of done that, and it worked pretty well. And I'm like, okay, I'm a coach now, and I can run a coaching business. And this whole scaling thing is an entirely different skill set again. And that's been a really interesting journey for the past, 2-3 years. The evolution into a brand Yannick, that is no longer me, but it is also me. That's a strange one for someone with such high values and authenticity and realness. You know, but it's important, because otherwise we can't reach that many people. And it's super meaningful to me to reach more people. It's more meaningful to me to reach more people with good content than for everything to sound exactly how I would say it. But it's been a journey to kind of distance myself from that and allow that to take on its own life. I'm still sitting a bit weird with me, you know?
I know, I totally get it. We have a similar situation at Animas, and I recently wrote a I guess it's a policy statement, but it's more than that. It's kind of a living manifesto on how humans and AI interact to create content, and the fact that everything gets passed through me before it goes out, because it's got to be truthful to there'll be nothing we say that doesn't represent what we are. But when you're an individual brand like you are, as opposed to a company brand like we are, it must feel even more personal and even more kind of like, oh my goodness me, like what voice is that? It's not quite mine. So, when you think about what you're trying to communicate, let's kind of go back to the existential thing and who you are as a coach, because presumably if you're communicating, there's something you want to say. So, how would you encapsulate the sorts of thing you're trying to say to the world?
Yeah. Well, it's somewhere along the lines of stopping to fight the inevitable, right? To embrace the natural challenges that being human entails. Being in the world with other people it's a difficult condition, right? We have all this anxiety, all this uncertainty, the existential givens, freedom and endings and responsibility, authenticity, isolation. They're all ingrained in what it means to be alive. And actually, we can embrace that. We can value it because that's the stuff that makes life worth living, right? If everything was certain and we didn't have anxiety, it just wouldn't feel human. The stories we value, the stories we write books about and make movies of, and that are worth telling to our grandchildren or to our friends are the ones of struggle and challenge and overcoming and difficulty. That's just part of it, and that's what makes being human so special. So I see so many people just trying to avoid this humanness rather than lean into it, and often when they lean into it, it's kind of begrudgingly. And I think it's that it's not unique, but this combination of positive psychology and existentialism that got me to develop this perspective of just seeing it very positively, of all this darkness and anxiety that, I can embrace that. That's the stuff that makes life worth living, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Okay, I have my moments where I want it some other way, but not for long, because then it would feel it's not even a possibility. So I want to invite the world and the world of coaching, because they have a generative impact on other people, to kind of open that perspective up. I would like to invite people in general to engage that perspective, or at least have it as a lens, so that for a moment you can kind of sidestep and look at your situation with an existential lens, a positive existential lens. And then I think you find a lot more peace in life, even though that peace is not characterized by happy emotions and comfort, but it's the kind of peace that lives in tension, right? There's an energy in that tension. And I think we can value that. Certainly, if we don't, what's the alternative? I'm sure there's other alternatives. We have more of a philosophical kind of discussion around it. But I think it's a really valuable tool to have in your bag. And it's a really valuable perspective to internalize. At least that's been my experience and the ones of many people that I talk to.
Speaking of tension, one of the areas of tension I've often felt in the coaching field is the act of coaching itself is one of unknowing. And what you might call epistemic humility, let's say. And yet, to build our brand, we have to communicate a level of knowingness about something. We don't have to, but we might choose to. And in a sense, you are choosing to, because you're choosing to speak about a particular field of existential being. And the nature of reality as you perceive it, although somebody else might say, no, it's not like that at all. How do you manage? Because presumably when people come to you, they're coming to you because at least some of them have seen that content. And they're like, oh my goodness, that resonates. But then they come to you and you're a coach. You're not a philosopher or a guru or a teacher. How do you navigate that tension, if indeed there is any tension there?
Yeah, there's less and less tension over time, particularly because I'm less married to certain ideas of what coaching is and isn't. Right, I'm much more about dialogue now, and I have a part of me who is still important to that we draw certain boundaries. For example, I had a client who just didn't have any kind of commitment to anything in particular going forward or any vision. They're just like completely just let's have conversations and see where this is going. This is great. I just like having conversations with you. So we just called it existential conversations. And I felt it was important that we change the contract slightly and just kind of take the word coaching out or change a few bits. It's important to kind of manage expectations so that you're both on the same page. But I don't longer think there's a tension there if I, for example, share an idea or an experience or even an opinion or a sensation that I have, because if we're just two humans spending time together, and we have agreed that, what is the coaching part in this? What is the existential part in this? And that actually matter. And what do you want from this? And do you want more of these kind of conversations is what I often ask at the end of a consultation. We have spent some time together now. You get a sense for me. You get a sense for the kind of questions I'm asking and how I'm asking them. you have an experience of what it's like to be in conversation. Do you want more of this? And then there's some things you contract about, but I might already, especially when I work with coaches, especially in this rocket supervision approach, right, where you just get access to all of my professional hats, that allowed me to have a lot more freedom to go where it feels like we need to go right now, rather than being constrained by ideas of what we are and are not allowed to do because we've called it coaching or we've called it supervision. And my training with ICCS actually opened that door, that, in supervision, it's not just you bring a client scenario and then we focus on how can you do that better or what's in it to learn. It's like, I can offer advice and suggestions and guidance. There is a mentoring element to supervision. And actually, coaches really want that, especially at the beginning when they're just starting out. That's the whole idea of the rocket, right? At some point when we're in orbit, we jettison the fuel tank. We no longer need it. So we no longer need the input, the information, the models, the show me how it's done, right? We just need someone to hold space and reflect things back so we can continue to grow. So for me, there's no longer a tension there if I agree that this is what they're getting, right? Because one moment it might be a piece of mentoring, then 10 minutes later, there's a deep existential conversation that we're having, and maybe at the end we role play closing a consultation. So it really, what is working for you? What do you want? What do you need? And being quite transparent around it, letting the client take as much responsibility for this as humanly possible, and then we create something together. And that's kind of different depending on who's coming. So yeah, that's kind of how I navigate that tension. It's less tensional.
It's funny because I made up a word today when in readiness for my interview with you, or my conversation with you, which was fruitious.
Fruitious.
When I have a meeting, we have some fruition, and I thought, nice word is fruitious. So I googled it to see if it was real, but it wasn't, sadly.
I'm sure tensional isn't a word either.
But this is interesting. I mean, do you feel, I'm not that you're guiding the whole profession, but do you feel like you are in some way a canary, not a canary in the mine, that's probably the wrong phrase, but are you leading the way to where the profession is going? Or is the profession hanging stubbornly on to its fixed identity and will be rocked by the incoming AI, as we talked about earlier? Like, what? Given that you're being more fluid, I remember reading a book. I can't remember if you interviewed the chap, but Reinhard Stelter.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought you did. And he wrote Third Generation Coaching. And, one of the things he talks about is this idea of collaborative narrative coaching, which is very much more of a dialogue in which both parties can share their ideas about something. And it sounds like that's more what you're talking about. So what's the future of coaching in your mind?
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that you had that thought that I'm guiding the profession. It's quite a tall order. I'd like to believe that I have some influence on where some coaches go, and I would be very proud if I can influence the field in some positive way. But coaching is such a huge range of what it can be, and so I had a phase where I wanted it to be one thing that everybody understands what people mean when they say coaching, but I no longer think it's helpful in some ways, but I don't think it's desirable, because part of the beauty of coaching is that it is such a broad range and such a broad umbrella term for different approaches, and different approaches are helpful for different people at different times. So I like integrative work, and I think in many ways that is the future of the profession. But we will always have very niche experts on particular methodologies. And that's good, right? So finding the right coach for you will continue to be the future of the profession. And with AI incoming, there will be some huge changes, right? People like David Drake, who we also had on the podcast, Narrative Coaching, is part of Rebecca's academy to like some of the thought leaders in AI and coaching. And I hadn't put David Drake in there at all. I thought it was more like the existential approach. It's like that it couldn't be further away from AI. But there's so many meeting points. And I think the essential thing is that coaches will focus a lot more on mastery than they have had to do in the past, right? Because they will need to focus more on mastery and leaning into the human practices, the relational practices. And that's a really, really interesting space to be in, right? So what I see myself, and I mentioned we just released this epic starter kit. My Ambika had asked me for a few lead magnets, and I basically gave her an entire encyclopedia of everything that I've ever created for new coaches, and just kind of put it out there. And I made sense of why I created so much work for myself, but it made a lot of sense because I wanted to leave a piece of legacy that can operate and continue to operate with the systems that we have set up, even if I were to entirely focus on advanced and mastery coaching practice. Or if somebody offered me a job tomorrow and it was too good to turn down, I don't know. But like, there's a lot that I'm leaving behind that is kind of timeless for new coaches to build their practice and get over the first hurdle to then be able to focus on coaching mastery, because that's really where my passion lies. I love helping new coaches get over the edge, and jump and become coaches. It's super satisfying to see new coaches entering the field. But I've always been kind of more drawn to the advanced practice and the bigger questions and the subtle, like the navigation of, is this still coaching? Is it something else? Does it even matter? The ethical stuff, the big picture existential questions, the stuff that is underneath the surface, the dynamics, this is really interesting. So I think the future of coaching will be much more relational. We'll be navigating how to integrate or whether to integrate AI into our practice, probably more a matter of how, not if. And then to work with what's possible with AI and build on it through human relationships. Because I think people will really have to kind of grapple with what it means to be human in a world where AI is doing most of the jobs better than humans do. I hopefully will have maybe some sort of unconditional basic income so people don't starve when they're not working. I hope we're not creating more bullshit jobs just to give humans something to do. I think we'll see a huge surge in more relational jobs. But then people will struggle to learn relational skills in a world that is dominated, their interactions are dominated by AIs. So I think more than ever, life coaches will be important, and more corporate work will be done by AI coaches, with some oversight. So I think it'll be really interesting to see the surge in life coaches who are trained in relational practices to give people human spaces to connect to their own humanness and with other human beings in a world where most of the communication has some sort of AI involved.
It's funny, years ago, I wrote a blog post, which is still on the Animas site. It was called something like Utopia or Dystopia, Coaching in the Age of AI or something. And one of the things I used to say for years when I used to run the introduction to coaching was, when robots and AI take over most jobs, what's left for human beings is being human. And I still believe that's true, but it is fascinating how AI is even aping that so well. And it's kind of interesting. What you've alluded to there is fascinating for me, because that was the conclusion I came to, which is essentially coaching and akin kind of professions will all be fundamental about how do you make meaning when your career is no longer the primary way of making meaning.
Yes.
It's going to be fascinating. I remember reading a book years ago called Play a Piano by Kurt Vonnegut, in which society had basically was split into two, between managers and engineers of AI and robots and everybody else who lived in kind of slums and had no work and lived meaningless lives. And the book was essentially around was very dystopic, and it was essentially around how people made meaning of their life with nothing to do. And it is kind of interesting to see. I mean, I love AI, I must say, but I got to say, I also love it in the short term. I'm not sure I'm going to love it in the long term, but we will see. But it's a fascinating journey we're on.
Yeah, it brings up a sense of sadness, because the first time I really thought about this and talked about this was at my very first conference that I was invited to. And I remember I connected to Paul Wong, who is one of the grandfathers of this positive psychology existential integration. And he's died recently. He's died last week. So that's really left a mark. But he was the first person who really supported me academically, inviting me to a conference, paying for my accommodation, giving me a slot with all of these doctors and professors. And I remember talking about existential coaching as a meaning-making intervention and the upcoming meaning crisis in the face of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. it still took some time. It will still take some time, but I still believe that's a pathway that existentially we have to worry about. So I think existential coaches, not just existential coaches, but existential coaches particularly, can really play a big role in helping people make sense of their place in the world when, their meaning structures collapse. And for most people, work and career is their primary source of meaning, right? So
I remember a few years ago, Yannick, there was a real critique of coaching, maybe late 2000, I guess it was after the crash, 2008, 2009, 2010. There was a real critique of coaching as essentially propping up a capitalist system that was, hierarchical and unequal and blah, 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 and all these things. And coaching came under a real spotlight of essentially being a corporate tool to make people perform better and feel happier in the job they were in and all this sort of stuff, for good or bad, whether that critique is right or wrong. But I'm wondering, could what you've just talked about be seen as the same, like almost like a palliative care process for humanity as it goes through this real meaning crisis? And there we are as coaches helping them cope with that. Wow, this has gone very deep philosophical kind of conversation, isn't it? But I'm kind of curious on that. Like, are we just a palliative care service at that point?
Well, I think it depends how we engage that conversation or these kind of concerns, right? Because it's similar to, reminds me of mindfulness and how that's been used as a tool to remedy corporate stress, and it's been embraced by corporates to just help their workforce not lose their shit in the face of surmounting pressures, and that's a weird form of mindfulness, right? Because essentially that's a form of meditation that helps you be grounded in the now. And so as a meditation, it's not a tool to reduce stress, but it works as such, right? So similarly, that kind of practice, that kind of existential or like coaching practice where we hold space for someone, helping them to make sense of their human experience, you could use it as a remedy tool so people don't kill themselves, or lose all energy and kind of become these life zombies. But that's not really what the practice is about. And if it's getting used for that, obviously there's some value to it. But I think that's where it becomes a methodology, right? And then you'll have AI ask you some existential questions and go through find your why process to connect to something that's larger than you. In some way, I'd kind of value it being used in that way, but obviously there's so much more potential to it. And that's where the humanness comes in, right? The complexity of sitting down with another human being in relationship and not imposing your agenda. I saw a recent piece of research. I'm writing a chapter on existential coaching currently for the latest, for the next Passmore book. Although the next one, there might be 8 in between, but it's coming out next year. And there was a piece of research I found from this year, 2024, where the researcher interviewed, I think, 8 existential coaches. And one of the strongest themes that came out was that the existential coaches were offering wisdom and knowledge and kind of adding philosophy into the coaching process actively. And I'm like, but that's not what this is about. But apparently that's how coaches have been using it. So I think in existential coaching perspective, if you look at the philosophy, it's crucial that you respect other people's worldviews and their way of navigating whatever they need to navigate, and not inserting your own worldview and agenda and values and beliefs.
Yeah.
And you can put your own worldview on the table and let it dialogue with the other worldview. But as a coach, you need to be really careful not to enter that kind of power dynamic where sharing your worldview will have a profound influence on the other person's worldview. So sometimes I have clients that are just like, you're doing it wrong, but also it's coherent in itself. So it's really not up to me to judge. And that can be quite difficult, not just in existential practice, but any coaching practice. So I think it's important that we let people grapple with their human condition in their way. And if we look at existential practice as this kind of remedy to meaning crisis, that's not what that is, even though it might be valuable work.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Yannick, I used to teach the existential coaching course before I handed it on to you. And in my very, very first attempt at teaching it, I was a very bad trainer in some ways. I was engaging and kind of fun, and the energy was good. But when I look back, it was come from a very strong position of knowing. And two ladies came up to
Well,
me.
didn't that shift?
Well, it did shift. Absolutely, it shifted. Yeah, sure. But yeah, it really did. It went through a profound change because of my time at Metanoia Institute. That was when I went, oh my goodness, there's a whole different way of doing this. But anyway, these two ladies came up to me and said, we're going to leave if it's okay because this isn't for us. And anyway, they were born again Christians, and and I thanked them for the time and so on. But I realized, blimey, it must be, they've come to this to understand existential coaching, and there's me banging on at the front about the meaninglessness of the world. Well, it's not meaningless for them if they've got a God. That really brought home to me at that point. It's kind of silly because I feel so mature that I even did that at that age, because it wasn't like I was 20 years old. You know what I mean? I must have been 40 odd. But nonetheless, it really brought home to me that the your belief, not one's belief in existential things can be so rock solid sometimes you forget that other people have belief systems that are equally rock solid and
Mhm.
simply don't engage with the existential issues, like the idea that we should be anxious because of meaninglessness or the choices we have or the freedom. All that stuff is like, no. I believe in, like, if you speak to a Muslim who, be inshallah, and then they're not worried. That, I'm not saying there's no anxiety in Islam, of course, but you get my point. Is that different
Yeah.
belief systems bring very, very different things, and that was a real wake up call to me. I'm like, oh my God, I feel slightly embarrassed about how strong I was, how strident I was at the front of the class.
I had a similar experience when I sent the draft of my book, the final draft, I think it was, for comments and some endorsements to various people. You were one of those kind people who wrote a few nice lines, and I sent it to Ernesto Spinelli. And he came back to me and invited me to look beyond the school of existential coaching that I had been trained in.
Yes.
And I think there were some tensions with Emmy, and I think they disagree on a number of things, like existentialists often do. But he still wrote me something, which I rated him highly for. But if you read it carefully, it's not as endorsing as it could be, and for a good reason, right? And he was the only one who gave me really quite critical feedback, which was super helpful and made me add a couple of changes in the book. But I think, and we had a little conversation about this before we started this podcast, right? We all live in bubbles in some way or another. We can never see the full picture. So I try to, that's the best we can do, right? Try to be as conscious as we can that there are other perspectives, even if we don't know what those perspectives are yet, right? And I know a number of perspectives that kind of are in tension with existential thought. To me, it's the one that makes the most sense. But in coaching, it really doesn't matter, what I believe, because a lot of the existential coaching is not existential philosophical conversations. I, most of the time, don't mention any philosophers or existential concepts or ideas. But it's just that the lens allows you to be curious about people's relationship with some of these concepts that are just really elevating the conversation, open different doors. And it doesn't matter if somebody agrees with the framework or what they believe in, but it allows you to explore that more. And that's really what it's all about, adding more lenses to your coaching practice, or apply more lenses in your coaching practice so people have more awareness, and then more choice opens. And then they can take more responsibility in their life and their experience more. And how beautiful it is to own your experience, but also challenging, right? Because if you take responsibility for all of the things that maybe you should be taking responsibility for, your life is a lot more uncomfortable than it could be. In a lot of ways, it's much nicer to live in a beautiful illusion. And, that's, I know that's what people do. I know that to some extent I do that. I don't face all of it, I try to, but, not everybody does. And that's understandable. It's just at different times in our lives, we might need to open those kind of doors, because that's often where the answers lie to why we're feeling stuck or weird, or and just if not anything else, then just to accept that I'm feeling like this now, and that's not something to be ashamed of.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because that's the realization I came to when I decided to change my life. It started this year. move abroad, travel the world, become single. And one of the things I realized was that there would be times I was lonely. There's no way you can't be. If you're traveling the world as a solo traveler,
Oh yeah.
you're going to be lonely. And I realized that all my life, every time I'd felt lonely, I'd plugged somebody into that loneliness to resolve the problem. And I realized that part of my journey was to figure out how to live through the loneliness rather than try to solve the loneliness, because I also knew there were so many other aspects of my life that I wanted that would inevitably have to have loneliness in it if I wanted those things. It's that I actually learned a lot from you around existentialism, because I remember I used to think that, in a way, quite naively, that existential coaching was sort of about resolving things in your life that were existentially challenging. And one of the things I learned from you through the dialogue at the first instance wasn't, and you didn't say no, it's not, but the thing that came from me was, no, it's about living with the tension between things that are irreconcilable. And that's what I realized about my life now. There are things that are so important to me, but they bring inevitable downsides. And my job now is to live through that and learn from it, as opposed to try to solve it, which is what I used to do. By the way, solving things is pretty damn good too. But when you solve something, you tend to create another problem somewhere else, It's a bit like
Yeah.
whack-a-mole.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, this is really moving. And Nick, Nesh, our friend Nesh, right? Nesh
Mm,
Popovich. He once had a conversation with me about aloneness and loneliness, and it really shifted something, because it's inevitable that you feel alone at times, that you are alone at times, because there's none of the people around you.
mm,
But you can never feel lonely, because we can always have a chat, because I feel so connected to you and have been for a decade, right? I don't think that's going to go away.
yeah,
So I think there's something about being in the world, even if there's no people around you, there's always connections to people that we feel connected with. And you're one of those people, right? Even if we don't talk that much,
for
um,
sure.
I
Well,
always feel that connection every time we have a conversation,
yeah.
because we align philosophically in quite a lot of ways, and that means a lot.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I don't want to make this a coaching session for myself, but it's what I found fascinating is a little bit like confidence. When the client says, "I'm not confident," and you say, "Well, how did you get here today?" And it's like, "Well, they went on the underground and they walked to your office." It's like, "Well, you're pretty confident to do that." So actually, confidence is a contextual thing. It's like you tied your laces pretty well. I'm sure you didn't think you were going to fail at that. And loneliness is the same. There are different kinds of lonelinesses, if that's a word, and some of those are hard to resolve in the short term. It's been a fascinating journey for me. 9, 10 months, 11 months now of traveling by myself. It's interesting. I love it. I love it because it throws up things you've got to face about yourself and the world.
Yeah, it's one of those existential things, right? That's no longer an option for me, right? It's always an option. I do have a choice to leave my
Uh-huh.
family behind for 8 months, but realistically, I'm not going to choose to
Yeah,
do that,
yeah,
right? So it's one of those things. One of the few regrets I had is to not have gone solo traveling, when I had the chance to, and it's something. We make life choices, and I wouldn't look back, but.
yeah.
Nobody's immune to that, right? Oh, imagine the life you could have lived. Imagine what your life would be like if you hadn't made this, that, or the other choice or commitment. And I remember a scene from The Crown, a very British show about the Queen, where she spent some time with horses, and she shares with somebody. I don't remember what it was, but she's like, the life I could have lived, because she really wanted to spend time with horses and not be queen. He just kind of got thrown into this. And
Mhm.
existentially, this idea of being thrown into this, that, or particular life, and yes, she did have a choice, because her predecessor made the impossible choice of
Yeah.
renouncing the crown, and for her, it just never appeared as an option, although
Mm.
it clearly was. And so it's so interesting to see how people make choices. And not a big fan of the royal family, but funny how it came in as a wonderful illustration of existential themes and choices in the context of who we are and choices we make.
We let's wrap this up now, and we've talked about long-term, big global future. What's your future, immediate future? What lies ahead for? When's your next book coming out? That's the first priority question.
Yeah, so I've been having a plan in my head for some time about a series of podcasts exploring global perspectives on existential coaching. I'd
Mm,
love to turn that into a conference where different people debate and talk to each other. I'd love to turn that into an edited book and then into a series of courses, of trainings, so that we can grow existential coaching. Also, we're looking at another baby. So that means some other things need to be in place, because I don't think the market for existential coaching is quite there to finance that all.
It's coming. We've talked about it. It's coming.
Exactly. So the coaching lab we've been working on for a couple of years, and I'm still committed to creating a community of practice and inviting people into that, not just to see what coaching looks like in practice and connect theory, but also to just work together, bring people together who committed to coaching mastery and good practice and integrating different ideas, different perspectives, different methodologies, and just become better coaches. Right. So the one-on-one is where my heart blossoms. I love those dialogues. So I'm always going to do one-to-one existential coaching, whatever coaching it needs to be, right, as we said earlier. I work with a lot of coaches in supervision, and I'm growing my groups. I run 12 supervision groups. So there's more slots. It just becomes more affordable for people to enter these kind of spaces. And the group experience is really valuable. And then that's the kind of immediate to grow that more. I'm really keen on doing more existential leadership work, because whenever I work with someone existentially, they're already in a leadership position, right? So I've been doing leadership work my whole life, even if they weren't in a corporate leadership position. But the bigger the organization is that somebody takes responsibility for, the more generative impact it can have, right? So, and as I said, I really get a lot of drive from the generative impact that your work has on other people in the world. And so currently I'm making some phone calls to see if maybe I can take this to a larger scale. And that would also mean I can drop the price of the coaching leg by half and just invite more people in. I don't need to use this to finance my life, right? So there's some interesting changes potentially coming up. I'm always juggling a few things, but I have much more focus now. There's the work with organizations, there's the work with coaches, and then there's the work with individuals interested in developing existential lenses. And that's the three areas that I'm focusing on, and that are meaningful to me. And who knows what the future brings.
Who knows, indeed. And if anyone wants, we'll put this in the show notes anyway, but if somebody wants to get hold of you either as a supervisor or to attend coaching labs, what are the contact details?
Yeah, best way for coaches, best address is rocketsupervision.com, as you would speak it. Best address for coaching is existential.coach. And well, you can just Google me. I think I'm all over the place. So reach out. What's that?
Coaching labs?
Oh yes, gocoachinglab.com.
Gocoachinglab.com. That's good to know. Great.
But we've included that in Rocket Supervision as well. So yeah, find that out. I'm always keen on having people's feedback. What I often say is, if any of this resonates, make it swing, right? Because these conversations, I know they resonate, and I want people to make them swing so we can enter that sort of conversation and they can take the conversation to other people, right? I want to start more conversations with these conversations. So hopefully we could make you who is listening or watching this think about some stuff, maybe in a different way. So if that's you, then maybe share that with someone. And I think we grow through conversations, right? I'm living that. So go have some conversations.
Yannick, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the 4 seasons of Coaching Uncaged that you've done for us. It's been amazing. And we've covered a lot of ground. We've gone through the different theories and different interviews with thought leaders. It's been an amazing journey. So thank you so much for doing that. But more, I want to thank you for the contribution you make to the coaching profession. It really, really, I think you've made an amazing difference, especially within your chosen field of existential coaching, but beyond that too, especially since you became a supervisor. So thank you for everything you do. Really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure our journey doesn't end here. That's absolutely for sure. I know that.
Yeah, me too. Cool. Well,
Thank
then
you.
I'll see you soon. Thank you very much for the platform.
Thank you.
And I hope people took lots away from it.
Thank you.
To watch these episodes on video, make sure you also check out youtube.com/animascoaching. See you back here soon.